She looked me dead in the eye and said, "You need to stop whining and start acting like a real man." Those words burned into me like a scar I didn't ask for. It wasn't the first time she had thrown something like that at me, but that night it hit differently. Maybe because I had finally reached the point where anger felt quieter than pain. "Just move on," she added, rolling her eyes. "Real men don't hold on to drama." She said it like she was giving me advice, but we both knew it was a dismissal. I smiled, not because it didn't hurt, but because something inside me finally snapped in the calmest way possible. That's when I realized I didn't need to fight anymore. I just needed to let go. But I didn't say a word. I simply nodded and told her she was right. Before we go deeper, make sure to subscribe, like, and drop a comment below if you've ever been told to be a man just for feeling something real. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this ends. It had been building up for months, maybe even years. We'd grown distant, though she'd insist it was me. Every time I tried to talk about what was wrong, she'd roll her eyes, call me sensitive, or worse, weak. I guess in her mind, vulnerability and masculinity couldn't exist in the same space. Her name was Jessica. We met in college, and at first, she was drawn to what she called my depth. She said I made her feel safe, seen, grounded. But once the world started demanding more, money, success, image, that depth became an inconvenience. Suddenly, the things she once loved about me were the things she resented most. I wasn't spontaneous enough. I wasn't ambitious enough. And when she finally met someone who was, at least on the surface, everything she thought she wanted, she didn't hesitate to move on. The night she told me about him was ordinary in the cruelest way. We were sitting in the kitchen, the hum of the fridge filling the silence between us. She was scrolling on her phone when she sighed and said, almost casually, "There's someone else." It just kind of happened. I remember my fork stopping midair. For a second, I thought she was joking, but the way she looked at me, flat, detached, told me she wasn't. I asked why. Not angrily, just quietly. Her answer was a smirk. "He's confident. He knows what he wants. He's not emotional." That pause before the last word cut deeper than anything. Emotional. Like it was an insult. Like caring made me less of a man. I sat there, staring at her, feeling the weight of years collapse in a single sentence. Then she delivered the final blow. "Be a man, Daniel. Move on." I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I didn't even try to argue. I just got up, went to the bedroom, packed my things into a duffel bag, and left my key on the counter. When I walked past her, she didn't say a word. Maybe she thought I'd come crawling back. Maybe she thought I'd text her the next morning asking for another chance. But I didn't. That night, I walked out into the cold air and kept walking until the pain turned into something else, clarity. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. I was just breathing on my own. The first few days were brutal. You never realize how much of your life someone occupies until they're gone. The apartment felt like a ghost of her laughter, her perfume, her voice echoing in the walls. I threw myself into work, then into silence. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to explain. I wanted to rebuild from the ground up. I started running in the mornings, just to burn through the anger that had nowhere else to go. I spent nights reading, learning, reflecting, rediscovering who I was before her. It wasn't about revenge. It was about recovery. A week later, fate did what fate does best. It threw me a twist I couldn't have seen coming. I was in line at a small coffee shop near the office when someone tapped me on the shoulder. I turned, and there she was, Emily, Jessica's younger sister. We hadn't seen each other in over a year. She used to come by sometimes, and we'd talk about books, music, life, things Jessica never cared much about. She was different, softer, wiser in quiet ways. When she saw me, her eyes softened. "Daniel," she said. "Hey, you okay?" I smiled faintly, trying to hide the exhaustion in my face. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just getting coffee." She looked at me for a moment, the kind of look that sees straight through the surface. "She told me what happened," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." We sat down at a corner table, and for the first time since that night, I actually talked. Not to vent, not to gain sympathy, just to talk. Emily listened, really listened, the way her sister never did. There was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. She said something I didn't expect. "You didn't deserve that. You were never the problem." Those words hit me harder than Jessica's ever could, not because they were dramatic, but because they were simple and true. We talked for hours, and by the time the cafe closed, The ache in my chest had turned into something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. That night, as I drove home, I realized that moving on wasn't about proving Jessica wrong or getting even. It was about rediscovering the part of me she tried to silence. The part that felt, cared, and loved deeply. And maybe, just maybe, it was about finding someone who could see that as strength, not weakness. The following week passed quietly, but not in an empty way. There was something grounding about being alone after years of trying to keep someone else happy. I went to work, came home, cooked for myself, and sat in silence that didn't feel heavy anymore. The ache was still there, yes, but it was clean, like a wound finally starting to heal. Every morning, I ran a little farther, pushed a little harder, and every evening I felt a little lighter. Then one evening, Emily texted. Just a simple message. Hey, I'm around if you ever want to talk again. I stared at the screen for a while, thinking about how natural our last conversation had felt. There had been no tension, no pretending, just honesty. So I said yes. We met that Friday. She picked a small restaurant on the corner of 5th and Maple, the kind of place where no one rushes you to leave. When she walked in, she looked warm and relaxed in a simple navy sweater, her hair tied back loosely. We hugged awkwardly at first, but then it felt right. Over dinner, she asked how I was really doing. And I told her about the work I was doing, the quiet nights, the weird sense of calm I'd found. She smiled and said, "It's strange, isn't it? How peace feels so unfamiliar after chaos." I nodded. She understood in ways her sister never had. We talked for hours again, losing track of time. The conversation flowed effortlessly. She had always been different from Jessica, less about appearances, more about depth. I'd noticed that before, but never let myself think too much of it. After dinner, we walked outside, and the city lights stretched across the skyline, soft and golden. The air was cool, carrying that faint smell of rain. Emily shivered slightly, and without thinking, I took off my jacket and draped it around her shoulders. She looked up at me with that same quiet understanding, and in her eyes, I saw something that felt like home. Days turned into weeks. We started texting regularly, nothing flirty, just conversations about life, about work, about how strange it was to navigate family dynamics when everything had changed. She mentioned that Jessica was still seeing that guy, but that things weren't going as well as she liked to pretend. I didn't ask for details. I didn't care. For the first time in years, my mind wasn't spinning around her. It was just still. Emily and I began to meet more often. Coffee, dinner, walks by the river. It wasn't planned, it wasn't forced, it just happened. There was a comfort in her presence, a quiet acceptance I hadn't realized I was starving for. We didn't talk about Jessica much, though sometimes she came up indirectly. One evening, sitting on a park bench with coffee cups in our hands, Emily asked me, "Do you ever miss her?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I miss who I thought she was," I said, "but not who she really turned out to be." She nodded slowly, her eyes soft. "That makes sense." As weeks passed, our friendship deepened into something unspoken but undeniable. There was a night when I dropped her off after dinner, and we sat in the car for a few extra minutes, neither of us ready to say goodbye. The air felt charged, and when she looked at me, there was something in her eyes that made my breath catch. "You're different now," she said softly. "Stronger, calmer." I smiled. "Maybe I finally figured out what being a man means," I said quietly. She tilted her head. "And what's that?" I looked at her for a moment before replying, knowing when to walk away from someone who doesn't see your worth. For a second, she didn't say anything. Then she whispered, "That's exactly what makes you one." Something shifted that night. Not in a dramatic way, not like in the movies, but in that quiet, inevitable way life sometimes does when you least expect it. We began spending more time together, not every day, but enough that I noticed the difference in my mood when we did. She brought laughter back into my life, but not the loud, forced kind. It was gentle, genuine. And for once, I didn't feel like I had to perform, to prove anything. She saw me, the real me, and didn't ask for anything more. One weekend, we decided to take a drive out of town, just to escape the noise for a bit. We ended up by a lake, sitting on the hood of my car, watching the reflection of the sun ripple across the water. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "You really did move on, didn't you?" I turned to her, my eyes steady. "Yeah," I said. I finally did. She smiled then, a small, sad kind of smile, and said, "Good. You deserve better than what she gave you." When I got home that night, I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. My mind replayed everything: the hurt, the words, the silence that followed, and how far I had come. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't even about closure. It was about acceptance. Jessica had told me to move on like a man. And maybe I finally understood what that meant. Not to bury emotions, not to harden my heart, but to grow, to let go, and to rise without turning back. Emily had helped me see that, not because she fixed me, but because she reminded me I wasn't broken in the first place. It had been almost 2 months since that first unexpected meeting with Emily, and in that time something inside me had shifted completely. My mornings no longer felt heavy. My nights no longer echoed with the same dull emptiness. I had stopped checking my phone out of habit, stopped glancing at old photos, stopped wondering what she was doing or who she was with. The version of me who once waited for her messages no longer existed. Instead, I found myself looking forward to new conversations, new laughter, new peace. Emily and I had built something that felt effortless, born from understanding rather than need. She never tried to fill the silence with meaningless words. Sometimes we could sit together for hours without speaking, just sharing space, and somehow it meant more than any grand confession ever could. But the world has a way of testing your peace, just to see if it's real. It happened on a Tuesday. I was walking out of my office when I saw her, Jessica. She was standing near the parking lot, leaning against her car, waiting. My chest tightened for half a second, but the emotion that followed wasn't anger or longing. It was indifference. I walked toward my car without saying a word. She called my name, her voice hesitant, unfamiliar even. I turned. She looked different, tired, thinner, her hair tied back without its usual perfection. "Can we talk?" she asked. I shrugged, not out of cruelty, but because the man she once knew would have stopped everything for her. That man was gone. Still, I agreed. We sat on a nearby bench, and for the first time, she couldn't look me in the eye. "I made a mistake," she said finally. I said nothing. He wasn't who I thought he was. He cheated on me, used me. Her voice cracked slightly, but I just listened. She continued, "I miss us. I miss you. I didn't realize what I had until I lost it." Her words fell into the air like stones, heavy but harmless. Once, they would have shattered me. Now, they just echoed and faded. "I'm glad you finally realized something," I said calmly. "But I'm not the same person you left." She stared at me, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. "You really don't care, do you?" she asked quietly. I smiled faintly. "I did. Once. Enough for both of us. But you told me to move on like a real man. So I did." Her face paled, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said the thing I think she came there to say all along. "Is there someone else?" I didn't answer. I just stood, put my hands in my pockets, and said, "That doesn't matter anymore." Then I walked away. That night, I told Emily what had happened. She listened without interruption, her expression calm, her eyes steady. When I finished, she said quietly, "You handled that perfectly." I smiled. I just told the truth. She leaned back in her chair, studying me for a moment. She's probably realizing what a real man looks like only after losing one. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Maybe, but I'm not doing this to prove anything to her." Emily smiled too, but there was something thoughtful in her gaze, something almost unspoken. "I know," she said. "That's what makes you different." The conversation drifted into something lighter after that. Movies, music, old memories. But there was a warmth between us now that hadn't been there before. A closeness that no one had dared to name yet. Over the next few weeks, we spent more time together. Sometimes at her place, sometimes at mine. We cooked dinners, watched shows, shared stories we hadn't told anyone else. I found myself looking at her differently, realizing that her kindness wasn't just a comfort, it was strength. The kind of strength that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, but simply stays. One evening, after another long conversation that stretched into midnight, we fell quiet. She was sitting across from me, the light from a candle flickering across her face, softening every feature. "Daniel," she said slowly, "can I ask you something?" I nodded. "If Jessica hadn't left, do you think you'd still be with her?" I thought about that for a moment before answering. Probably. And I'd probably still be miserable. Some lessons only come when you lose what you shouldn't have held on to in the first place. She nodded, her lips pressing into a small, knowing smile. I guess some people have to break us to make us better. There was a pause then, a long, heavy silence charged with something deeper. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us looked away. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No fireworks, no music swelling in the background. Just understanding. Then, slowly, she reached across the table, and I met her halfway. Her hand was warm, steady, real. That night, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a man trying to prove anything. I just felt like myself. But peace doesn't last long when the past refuses to stay buried. A few days later, Jessica showed up again. Not at my house this time, at Emily's. I got the call from Emily, her voice shaken but controlled. "She's here," she said quietly. She found out. I drove over immediately, and when I arrived, the scene was tense. Jessica was standing in the doorway, eyes wild, voice trembling with fury. "How could you?" she shouted. "She's my sister." Emily stood her ground, calm but firm. "You threw him away, Jessica. You told him to move on." Jessica turned to me, eyes full of disbelief and anger. "You're disgusting," she hissed. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice quiet but sharp as glass. "You told me to act like a real man." I did. I walked away from the woman who didn't deserve one. Then I took Emily's hand and turned my back on her, walking away without another word. I didn't look back, not once. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt free. The next morning felt different, like the air itself had shifted. There was no chaos, no guilt, no confusion, just clarity. Emily and I sat on the back porch of her small house, coffee cups in hand, the early sunlight spilling across the lawn. She looked tired but peaceful, her hair slightly messy, her eyes thoughtful. "You know she's not going to let this go easily," she said quietly. I nodded. "I know, but that's not my problem anymore." We sat there for a while, listening to the birds and the faint hum of the neighborhood waking up. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next emotional storm. I had already survived it. Later that week, Jessica tried calling me, then texting, then emailing. The messages started with anger, turned into guilt, and finally into pleading. I didn't respond to any of them. It wasn't out of cruelty, it was out of peace. There's something powerful about silence, something liberating about no longer needing the last word. Emily knew about the messages, but she didn't press me to reply or block her. She just said, "She'll stop when she realizes she no longer has your attention." And she was right. After a few days, the messages stopped. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was closured. In the weeks that followed, life found its rhythm again. I threw myself into work, not to distract myself, but because I finally enjoyed it again. My business had been slowly growing, and with Emily's quiet encouragement, I took it to another level. She believed in me in a way no one ever had. She didn't inflate me with empty praise. She grounded me with truth. She challenged me, supported me, stood by me when things got hard. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was real, and that was worth more than anything I'd ever had before. We became inseparable, not because we needed each other, but because we chose to be there. Then came the day that changed everything. A charity gala downtown, a mix of business, politics, and the kind of people who always had something to prove. I had been invited to speak about small business growth, and Emily came with me. She wore a dark green dress that caught the light perfectly, elegant and simple. As we stepped into the ballroom, I noticed the whispers, the glances. People knew who I was now. A year ago, I was a man broken by loss. Now I was a man rebuilt by purpose. And that's when I saw her. Jessica. She was standing near the bar, alone, holding a glass of wine like it was keeping her steady. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, the whole room seemed to fade. There was no hatred in her gaze this time, only realization. She walked over slowly, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Daniel," she said softly, "you look different." I smiled faintly. "I am different." She glanced at Emily, then back at me. "So it's true," she said, her voice trembling. "You and her." I nodded. "Yes." For a moment, her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. She looked smaller somehow, her confidence gone, replaced by the hollow weight of regret. "I didn't think you'd ever move on," she whispered. I took a sip of my drink and replied calmly, "You told me to." You told me to be a real man and move on. So I did. She flinched slightly, her eyes glistening. I didn't mean like that. I leaned in just enough for her to hear me clearly. That's the thing, Jessica. You never meant what you said. But I did. Then I turned away, took Emily's hand, and walked toward the stage as the host called my name. When I stood there, microphone in hand, looking out over the crowd, I didn't feel pride or revenge. I felt peace. I talked about resilience, about rebuilding from failure, about how sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what you're made of. I didn't mention her, but I knew she was listening. When the speech ended, the applause filled the room, but my eyes found only one face, Emily's. She was smiling, not in a showy way, but with quiet pride, like she'd known all along this was who I could be. Afterward, we danced, the soft lights reflecting off the floor, her hand fitting perfectly into mine. For a brief second, I caught Jessica standing by the exit, watching us. She didn't stay long. Maybe it hurt too much to see what she'd thrown away. Maybe she finally understood that love without respect is just control dressed up as affection. As the night ended, Emily and I walked outside into the cool air. The city lights glowed in the distance, and the faint hum of traffic filled the quiet spaces between us. You handled that perfectly, she said, squeezing my hand. I smiled. I didn't handle it. I just let go. She rested her head against my shoulder, and for the first time, I realized how light my heart felt. No bitterness, no resentment, just gratitude for the pain, for the lessons, for the chance to start over. Weeks later, word got around that Jessica had left town, moved somewhere new, started over again. I didn't wish her ill. I didn't wish her anything. She was a closed chapter, a story that had ended exactly where it needed to. As for me, I kept moving forward, not out of spite, but out of peace. I built the kind of life I once thought I needed her to make me worthy of. Only now I knew better. Worth isn't something someone gives you. It's something you reclaim. One evening, sitting on the same porch where this new chapter began, Emily looked at me and said, "You know, you really did what she told you to do." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly, her eyes catching the fading sunset. "She told you to move on like a real man. And you did. You just forgot to tell her that real men don't move on to prove a point. They move on to find peace." I smiled, leaned over, and kissed her forehead. She was right. Because in the end, strength isn't about winning or losing. It's about walking away with your integrity intact and never needing to look back. And if you've ever been told you're not enough, that you need to be stronger, or move on like a real man, remember this. You don't prove your worth by breaking others or begging for validation. You prove it by standing tall in your silence, by growing beyond the noise, and by becoming someone you're proud to be. If you felt this story, subscribe, like, and leave a comment. Because sometimes, walking away is the loudest way to say you've finally arrived.